Hello, in this lecture we're going to continue on supply and demand, chapter 4. Remember the objectives we have at this point. We've taken a look at state the law of demand and distinguish between shifts in demand from movement along the demand curve, state the law of supply and distinguish between shifts in supply from movement along the supply curve. We will now move on to explain how the law of demand and the law of supply interact to bring about equilibrium, as well as discuss the limitation of demand and supply analysis. So we're going to get to the point that we've all been waiting for at this point, and that is where and when supply meets demand, and they meet, of course, at that place and time called equilibrium. So we're going to talk about equilibrium, the point where supply and demand meet. Definition: equilibrium is a concept in which opposing dynamic forces cancel each other out. So those opposing dynamic forces are going to be the forces that are driving supply and demand, and that will drive to that point being equilibrium. In the free market, forces of supply and demand interact to determine equilibrium quantity. So this is going to be the point. That point will have an equilibrium quantity. That quantity is the amount bought and sold at equilibrium price, and it will have an equilibrium price. So an equilibrium price is the price toward which the invisible hand drives the market. So where this interaction happens, that's going to create that point. That point will have an equilibrium quantity and an equilibrium price. So if we look at the example of these two opposing forces and how they work, if there's an excess in supply, then quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. On the other hand, if there's an excess in demand, we have a shortage, quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So what will happen then, if we think about these two instances, is that price adjustments tend to rise when there is excess demand and fall when there's excess supply to reach an equilibrium. So if we think about this, we're going to say, okay, there's an excess supply. If we think about that in just like our donut shop, if we just had a donut shop and we have excess supply, we happen to notice that at the end of the day, we have more donuts than we are selling. We have an excess of supply. Well, what are we going to do in that case? We're probably going to lower the price of our donuts, so that what will happen is when we lower the price, we're probably going to want to produce less, because we have less profit, so the market overall will generally decrease. But as the price goes down, theoretically demand will go up because people demand more at the lower prices, and that will theoretically go towards equilibrium into some point where we're selling basically what we're producing at some point where those two things will even each other out. That's the invisible hand working. If we think about our store where we have a shortage, meaning we're totally out of donuts in the middle of the day and people are still coming in asking for donuts, and how might we adjust that? Well, we could adjust the quantity, but if we're at max capacity, we might adjust the price then. So remember, the price being the factor we're thinking about in this case. So if we have a shortage, then we can raise prices. And if we raise prices, then the demand will go down. People will demand less. We'll want to produce more at any given price because our profits will go up at that point in time. And once again, we'll find that equilibrium. So that's the imposing forces that are happening. Notice there's no external person outside of like a government or central planning unit telling the donut shop how many donuts they're going to make. It's this interaction between the supply and demand, the opposing forces, that will determine what equilibrium will be, that point in time, that point of price and quantity that will be produced. So if we think about that pictorially, then of course we've got our demand curve. Remember, we got our price here, we've got our quantity. And we look at the demand curve, it's sloping down. What that means is that at any given price, if the price goes up, then the demand will go down. If we look at the supply, then as prices go up, then supply will generally go up. And remember, we're not talking about the price being set necessarily by any individual store. We're talking about the market price, and the people that are producing are price takers. They whatever the price of the donut is, the price of the donut. You can't change that because that's the market price. If you change it, then you're probably going to go out of business if it was perfect competition market. And we'll talk about areas where it's not always perfect competition market, and we can differentiate. But this is the model we need to start with. So if there's excess in supply, it causes pressure downward. So notice if we have price up here, then we have an excess of supply, because obviously if we're up here, the supplier wants to produce this much, because if they could sell that much, that's where they'd be. But the quantity is only here, so that's how much is going to be demanded. this is how much is going to be supplied, and so we have a problem there. What's going to happen is the price is going to tend downwards, and it'll tend downwards, of course, until we meet at this point. And when we meet at this point, that is when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So notice there's pressure on both sides, on both the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, until we hit that equilibrium. And if we have excess demand, causes upward pressure. So notice if the price happens to be down here, then what happens is people on the supply side only want to supply this much. However, people are going to demand this much at that price. And if that is happening, then again, the market, just the market itself, is going to put upward pressure until we get back to this equilibrium point. So that's going to, all else equal, meaning the only thing we're changing is the price, the market price. We will tend towards equilibrium in this case. So using this model, we can take a look at a lot of different situations and look at a lot of different factors, including shifts in supply and demand and other types of factors. So political factors and social forces in equilibrium are some things that we can kind of apply and think into this model. If social and political forces were included in analysis, they provide a counter pressure to the dynamic forces of supply and demand. For example, so here's just some common examples we can take a look at in more detail, but we can see how these things might affect our supply and demand curves. So social pressure often offset economic pressure and prevent unemployed individuals from accepting work at a lower wage than currently employed workers receive. So we know that this is a common political issue. Basically, that the minimum wage is going to be an issue here, and we can see the same supply and demand curve in terms of workers, people in the employment market. And of course, the social pressure is that we want to have a livable wage on the minimum wage. But if we think about our supply and demand, if that minimum wage is below the equilibrium price, we know what's going to happen. We can see that we're going to have an excess amount of workers that are going to want work, and the suppliers of the work are going to supply less. And that's generally the concept here. And there's a lot of other factors that can come into there, but we need to, when we think about minimum wage type of activity, we need to think about that, because what we don't want to have happen is that we are creating a shortage of jobs. That's not the point. The point of the minimum wage, of course, is to increase the wage for as many people as possible at that price level. So when we think about the minimum wage, we really got to think about this type of dynamic and this type of analysis, and see if it's doing, or how can we make it do what we think it should do, given the fact of market pressures. So if we have existing firms conspire to limit new competition by lobbying Congress to pass restrictive regulations and by devising price strategies to scare off new entries. Notice here that when we talk about especially large companies, but any company, they do not like competition. We, the consumer, like competition because it's going to reduce the price of the things that are being produced. But we as the company, any individual company, does not have an incentive to compete on price. They have an incentive to eliminate competition and have as close to a monopoly as possible. So in order, large companies could do that, or try to do that, by lobbying. And remember, we've talked about the government as being somewhat like a referee. They're supposed to be a referee on the rules. And when they enter into the market, sometimes they can enter into the market or set rules that might be unfair. So if for example, if large companies lobbied for rules that could actually cost them money, like increased regulations, very costly regulations for different types of industries, that could actually cost large companies money. However, they may actually lobby to do that because they know that the mid to small size companies, who are their competition, will be completely devastated by that type of regulation because they just can't afford it. And so even though it costs a large company money, they might be gaining monopoly power by doing so, because it could drive others out of the market. And so notice that when we make laws, we need to be aware of that. Our laws, of course, we want to encourage competition in terms of the social policies, because usually that drives down prices. Renters often organize to pressure local government to set caps on rental price. We've seen this happen too, again, with really good intentions. A lot of times we've seen caps on rental prices, meaning that we cannot raise rental prices, or some just set a cap on how much rent can be rented for, how much apartment or something can be rented for. And we've seen that if it's not done very carefully, we could have very bad effects to the market. And the reason for that is because if someone's able to sell, if they bought the building and they're able to rent it out at a given price, and that someone comes in and says that we need to rent it out for a lesser price through regulation, again, we know what's going to happen. We're going to have a lot of demand for those places at first, and we're going to have very limited supply because there's going to be more supply than demand. And then in the long run, the person selling the person renting the property, the owner, may not have an incentive to keep up the property because they're not able to sell it at the price that it was selling at a free market price for. So what that could end up happening in the long run is take a pretty nice neighborhood and turn it into a not so nice neighborhood because of the fact that the building's not being kept up because it's being sold for less than. So again, these are ideas that have good intentions in place, but we've seen that they can have very negative consequences if we don't consider what the reality of how people act under different market conditions, under economic conditions. So we need to keep these things in mind when we put in policy conditions. So shifts in supply and demand. Shifts in either supply or demand change equilibrium price. So we've talked about shifts in supply and demand. Of course, that is going to change the equilibrium price. So anything other than price that is changing either supply or demand will shift the supply or demand curve rather than moving along the supply or demand curve, and that will affect the equilibrium price. So an increase in demand or an increase in supply creates excess demand at the original equilibrium price. Excess demand increase price until a new higher equilibrium price is reached. We'll look at this graphically in a second. A decrease in demand or an increase in supply creates excess supply at the original equilibrium price. Excess supply decreases price until a new lower equilibrium price is reached. All right, so let's take a look at an example of this. We've got our supply curve and our demand curve. We have price and quantity on the axes. We see our equilibrium point here. That is where the equilibrium point is for this market at this given time. If then we have a decrease in supply, that will generate excess demand. So price will increase until a new higher equilibrium price is reached. So first, remember, when might this happen? When would the supply be shifted in this way? Notice what is happening at this given price. We would produce here in production, and now production, the quantity produced, moved all the way in to here. So what would happen in order to shift? Well, it could be that costs went up in some way. So if the cost of inputs, if we make something that has oil in it or something like that, then and the price of oil went up, then that could increase our costs and it could shift the supply curve. So what's going to happen when that? Well, in the short run, you're going to have the excess of demand here because people are at this price. The price is still at this price. Then we have the quantity demanded out here. But now because of that change, because of that increase in the input, the supply is over here. That's how much is going to be wanted to be supplied. So over time, we're going to have the new equilibrium point here. So in the long run, after this takes effect and we have time for the changes to happen, the new equilibrium point will be here, price up here, and new quantity here. If we have a decrease in demand, so a decrease in demand generates excess supply. Price will decrease until a new lower equilibrium price is reached. All right, so we're going to take another look at same type of idea, but now the demand curve is shifting inwards. If we take a look at this point in price, we were here, and now the demand has shifted inwards for something other than price being changed. So what could have happened? Maybe the population went down, or maybe if we're selling donuts and there was a health report came out that said that donuts aren't healthy, then that might move our demand curve. So what would happen if that happened? Well, in the short run, we got the people still supplying at this price out here, but the demand is now in here. So now we have an excess supply. That's what we're looking at in the short run. Well, what's going to happen then over the long run is we're going to drift down to here. The two markets, the two forces acting against each other, bringing us to a new equilibrium price, the price going down and the quantity going down to this new equilibrium. So limitations on supply and demand. So we'll apply this strategy. This is going to be a very, very effective tool in economics. It's obviously applied in a lot of different areas. This is kind of the basis on which we think about most other types of things. but it is a model, and it is a simplified model that we'll have to consider other factors when we think about different situations. Here are some other factors we need to make sure that we consider when we think about more complex situations. So sometimes supply and demand are interconnected. So we've kind of thought about supply and demand as if they're completely separate from each other and contrary forces. We're going to have to think about some conditions in which they will be interconnected, and they could therefore act a bit differently. The other things held constant assumption is not likely to hold when goods represent a large portion of the entire economy. So obviously what we've done in this model, in any model, what we have to do is basically hold all other things constant and try to look at just two factors. In this case, we're looking at two factors and try to consider the relationship, the cause and effect relationship of those factors. Now, that's not always going to be the case, obviously, when we think of the larger context, and we're going to have to think about situations when we can't really hold that assumption true. We can't really hold the assumption of all other things being constant. The fallacy of composition is the false assumption that what is true for a part will also be true of the whole. This is a common fallacy when we think of things scientifically. Notice we always want to break things down, or we typically want to break things down to their building blocks and see, and in that way we think we can see the essence of things. But when we think of a part of something, that doesn't necessarily apply the same characteristics to the whole. For example, if we think about a person, we clearly would think that scientifically we want to break that person down to their smallest parts, atoms and quarks and nodes now, I guess. But if we look at an atom and we analyze it, we analyze its parts, and we just package those atoms and just put them in a lump together, it doesn't make necessarily a person. The properties of the atom we can't really apply to the person directly. And there's various reasons for that, but one reason, of course, is just it's the order of the atoms that are put together that also creates the person. So that it's the way it's not just the context of the material, it's the way the material gets put together. So the whole is worth more than the sum of the parts. We've might heard that saying before, that the whole is worth more than the sum of its parts, oftentimes. So when we break things down, we in a scientific method, we tend to want to break things down to parts because we want to analyze the essence of things. But we need to be careful that when we think of the essence of things, we can't just apply the essence of this piece to the whole necessarily, because we have to take into consideration the differences that happen based on order of things and whatnot. So again, very effective method to break things down to parts, but we need to keep into consideration that when we look at the whole, we can't just apply the properties of the parts to the whole.